That's definitely what I hope to see. If you would touch on, as we, kind of start to wrap up a little bit, the future of homeschool and school choice. And I know I don't know how political you want to get with that, but where do you see where do you see the future of homeschool and school choice going? I've talked to some people and they're nervous because they feel that homeschool is going to become more regulated as more people walk away. They worry that there's going to be a backlash from the traditional government schools because there'll be a lack of funding, because the more students that are leaving, and if we start to get some more of these ESAs, and there's more talk about education funding following funding students and not systems. So where do you see the future of homeschool and school choice going here in the United States, in the next year, 5 years, however range you want to look at it?
Right. It's a really great question because I think we are at this transformative moment in American education. I think that parents have been put back in charge of their children's learning in ways that never existed before. They've been able to become aware of schooling alternatives and of education outside of a conventional classroom, again, in ways that were unimaginable pre-pandemic. And they also, I think, recognize more about these education choice mechanisms and what they really could do than they might have before. I mean, I think previously, you said if you said something about school choice, it conjured up all kinds of different, often incorrect assumptions. And now, as parents are home and they're saying, well, gee, my school isn't opening, but I still have to, pay the taxes to go to that school. But the private school down the road is actually going to go out of business because, they are not getting funding. And, they start to sort of see how this all works out and begin to imagine if we could redistribute the more than $700 billion a year that U.S. taxpayers spend on K-12 schooling, redistribute that money, which works out to about $15,000 per student per year, to the families to use however they choose in this wide variety of education options, from homeschooling to various private school options to pandemic pods or micro schools to virtual learning, tutoring, online classes, in-person classes, programming, and all sorts of things, books and materials. I think parents begin to realize, wow, that would be a way of making sure that all parents, regardless of income, have an opportunity to find the best education for their child that's possible. And of course, that's what every parent wants. Every parent wants the best education for their children. So I think disconnecting spending from systems and funding students instead is going to be something that we'll continue to see gain traction as more families realize what that really means in terms of individual choice and parental freedom and empowerment. And I'll be surprised if parents would want to give up that sort of renewed control over their children's education. They'll want to expand that for others. I think we will see homeschooling continue to grow. I would be very surprised if some of this uptick in the number of new registered homeschoolers doesn't continue post-pandemic. Of course, some families will go back to school when everything ends and when they're able to resume normal classroom functions without social distancing and all-day mask wearing. Many parents will be eager to go back into the classroom, but I think other parents have been pleasantly surprised by what they're seeing through this pandemic version of homeschooling. They may have seen their children's curiosity and creativity rebound. They may be discovering all of the many educational resources they have available. And they may have always been kind of intrigued by homeschooling in the past, but lacked that catalyst to make it happen. And so now this is a good opportunity to do that. So, my prediction, it's hard to make predictions, but if I said, 3.5% of US school children were homeschooled pre-pandemic, I'd be optimistic to say that even after the pandemic ends, we might be up to, double that in terms of the homeschool population, which brings us to your other point, which I think is also really important. What about increased regulation of homeschooling as it becomes a greater influence in American education? And I think that that's to be expected. We're already seeing that. Of course, you mentioned the Harvard Law School professor Elizabeth Bartholet, who's been calling not only for a presumptive ban on homeschooling, but for much more increased regulation and oversight of homeschoolers. She had a recent article last week at Harvard Law Today where she brings this up again in relation to the pandemic. There's a law professor out of Duke University also calling for increased regulation of homeschoolers in that state. This was interesting because in North Carolina, so many parents submitted their online intent to homeschool forms the first week of July that it crashed the system's non-public education website. So there's just tremendous demand for parents to register as independent homeschoolers and sever ties with their local school, which of course would lead to, many people calling for increased regulation. I think we should be welcoming as homeschoolers, as people who believe in education choice and freedom and schooling alternatives. We should welcome families into homeschooling and just continue to be vigilant and push back against efforts to regulate the practice.
Yeah, and I also want to ask you, what do you think the future will be like for traditional government school teachers? Because we've talked a lot about students, outcomes for students and families. But I have a lot of friends who are still teachers. How do
Right.
you think this kind of reshaping of K-12 education as a whole? Do you think teachers will adapt? Do you think some teachers might choose to leave? I know, like I've seen families looking for teachers to instruct in these micro schools and these education pods and things like that. Do you think that there will be some teachers who will kind of move with the homeschoolers, or and how does that look? How does that happen for a teacher if they are wanting to move away from that traditional government school system?
That's right. I think it's important to remember that teachers are caught up in this same system of lack of choice, lack of freedom that students and families are. That often teacher creativity is diminished through this kind of one size fits all mass schooling model. And they are looking for alternatives as well. I've written even pre-pandemic about teachers who have left conventional classrooms to create schooling alternatives. In fact, my book is filled mostly with the stories of former public school educators who became so dissatisfied by what they were seeing in the conventional classroom that they left to create their own self-directed learning centers or alternatives to school, to really enable them not only to have a much more satisfying educational experience as a teacher, but to really create spaces for self-directed education. So I think education choice and freedom benefits teachers just as much as it benefits students. And I think the pandemic has really prompted many more of these innovations in education, micro schools, pandemic pods, for instance, that will continue to gain traction even after the pandemic. In one of my recent articles, I interviewed a high school English teacher in Illinois who said she was making $49,000 a year teaching ninth grade and AP English. And she was approached by several families in her area who were interested in podding, this pandemic podding, these micro schools, as well as one-on-one tutoring. And she now realizes she can make more money with fewer hours and much more flexibility outside of that conventional classroom. And I think more teachers are going to find that to be the case. And will, again, these entrepreneurs, these innovators creating these new models for learning outside of the classroom will help to accelerate those opportunities for teachers as well as for families and for kids.
Yeah, and like I said, we talked about the importance of goal setting and how that's important for our economy. And I think that that's true even for teachers. That's why I also feel that, getting some of this funding for students, I think in the long run, it will be positive for educators. And I think right now, a lot of educators are, they're not happy when they start to hear about these education alternatives. But yet, to me, I think if you are, really care about education, you'll look for those innovations. And if that funding is there, through funding the families and the students, not the systems, then that there will be that room for that economic growth. within education. So I think it's, can be a win for educators also. So I'm hoping to, to see more educators, and I'm starting to see some of that, where they're starting to kind of open up to, some of it's kind of forced, here, but hopefully there'll also be some organic, changes in education, and seeing teachers, kind of embracing some of these new models and new ways of thinking also. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kerry, for being here. And so again, Kerry McDonald, author of Unschooled. I'll put a link to her book in the comments. And then, Kerry, you talked about, I think, because you also have a tutor sharing, an online tutor sharing program that you've started. I'll get a link to that, but if you want to touch on that real quick, how that's working.
Nope, I do profile in many of my articles some of these microschool enablers and, kind of pod enablers. But the best way that your listeners can find me is to find me at FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, which is fee.org, fee.org/Kerry.
Okay. All right. Well, we will put that in the comments. But again, thank you. Kerry has just been an amazing voice, an advocate for homeschoolers. If you did not watch her debate with Professor Bartlett, definitely try to catch that. Just a lot of good points that she made. And so definitely a voice, as we're going forward here with all the changes in education. So thank you, Kerry, for being here today and for touching on these topics for people who are new to homeschool, but some of us who've been around and are also still exploring options for our kids. Thank you for all that you're doing to help us have more choices for our kids. So I appreciate
thanks, Rebecca. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate your time today. All right. Well, I will end our broadcast here. Thanks.
Take care.